What if winter was not just a season, but an enemy that had already decided to kill you? The wind arrived before the snow. It always did. A low, warning breath that crept across the land like a living thing, whispering through grass, slipping between stones, testing every weakness it could find. In the far north, winter did not announce itself with beauty or ceremony. It stalked. It watched. And when it finally struck, it did so without mercy. For the people who lived here, survival was never guaranteed. Not for a week. Not for a month. And certainly not for 100 days of unbroken cold. This is where the story truly begins, not with glory, not with battle, not with long ships cutting through black water, but with a question that haunted every Viking household as autumn faded into darkness. How do you stay warm when the world itself is trying to freeze you to death? The modern mind imagines Vikings as warriors first, survivors second. Axes raised. Shields locked. Voices roaring into battle. But that image hides a far more brutal truth. Long before a Viking ever faced an enemy across a battlefield, they faced something far more relentless: winter. And winter never retreated. It never negotiated. It never spared the weak. A single mistake, one poorly sealed wall, one damp firewood stack, one misjudged storm could mean the slow death of an entire family. Not in a moment of violence, but in silence. Fingers numb. Breath shallow. Bodies stiffening as warmth drained away, hour by hour. There would be no hero's death here. No songs. Only cold. And yet, they survived. Not for days. Not for weeks. But for 100 days of darkness, ice, and suffocating cold. Again and again. Generation after generation. The question is not if they survived. The question is how. Because the Vikings did not defeat winter through strength alone. They defeated it through knowledge, hidden, precise, and unforgiving techniques passed down in whispers, not boasts. Techniques that turned homes into heat traps, darkness into insulation, and fire into something sacred. Techniques so effective that, even when the world outside froze solid, life inside continued to breathe. But these techniques were never written down. They lived in hands hardened by labor. In instincts sharpened by loss. In traditions learned the hard way through starvation, frostbite, and graves dug into frozen earth. Imagine standing at the edge of a Viking settlement as the sun sinks lower each day, barely lifting above the horizon before retreating again. The air smells of smoke and damp wood. Animals are restless. Supplies are counted again and again, each time with a little more fear. Children are pulled closer to the fire, elders watching the flames as if reading prophecies in the sparks. Everyone knows what is coming. 100 days. 100 nights. No escape. This was not merely cold weather, it was a siege laid by nature itself. Rivers became walls of ice. Paths vanished beneath snowdrifts taller than a man. The sea, once a road, turned hostile and impassable. Isolation tightened its grip until each household became its own fragile universe. And inside those homes, the battle began. Every breath had to be conserved. Every ember guarded. Every decision when to burn, when to sleep, when to move could decide who would still be alive when spring returned. The Vikings understood something most civilizations never fully grasped: warmth is not just heat. It is strategy. They knew that fire alone was not enough. Fire could betray you. It consumed precious fuel. It filled rooms with smoke. It could die without warning. True survival required something deeper: control over space, air, time, and human behavior. Their homes were not shelters. They were machines. Machines designed to trap warmth, recycle it, and protect it from the endless assault of cold. Walls were not built merely to stand, they were built to absorb, store, and slowly release heat. Roofs were shaped not for beauty, but to resist wind that could strip warmth from flesh in minutes. Floors were layered not for comfort, but to separate life from frozen ground that sucked heat like a vampire. Even darkness had a role to play. During winter, light became dangerous. Light meant open flames. Open flames meant risk. So the Vikings learned to live with shadow, letting their eyes adapt, their movements slow, their days shorten. Time itself bent to the demands of survival. And then there were the rules, unspoken laws that governed winter life. Never waste heat on empty space. Never let moisture stay inside the home. Never sleep without preparation. Never assume tomorrow will be warmer. These rules were not superstition. They were written in blood. Because somewhere, sometime, someone had broken them and did not survive. This is the part of Viking life rarely told. The quiet terror. The constant calculation. The knowledge that bravery meant nothing if your home failed you at 40 degrees below freezing. That strength meant nothing if your firewood was damp. That honor meant nothing if your children could not feel their hands. Winter stripped away illusion. It revealed truth. And the truth was this: the Vikings who survived were not just warriors, they were masters of warmth. Masters of insulation before the word existed. Masters of airflow without science. Masters of thermal survival without technology. They learned how to make earth, wood, stone, and even animals work together to preserve a fragile bubble of life against overwhelming cold. They learned how to make winter hesitate. But these techniques came at a cost. Because to stay warm for 100 days, sacrifices had to be made, comfort surrendered, habits broken, bodies pushed to limits that left scars long after the ice melted. Survival demanded discipline, silence, patience, and sometimes, impossible choices. As the first snow finally fell, thick and heavy, sealing the land beneath a white grave, no one asked if winter would be deadly. They asked only one thing: would their knowledge be enough this time? That is where our journey truly begins. Not with conquest. Not with glory. But with a flickering fire, a sealed door, and a world outside that had already decided to kill everyone inside. What if the deadliest enemy the Vikings ever faced was not the sword, not the sea, not even their enemies, but the silence of winter itself? When the sun sank low enough to barely touch the horizon, when the land hardened into iron and the wind cut like a living blade, the world of the north became a place that did not forgive mistakes. Winter did not arrive gently. It came like a siege. Days shortened until time itself seemed to freeze. Snow buried paths, erased borders, and swallowed the weak without leaving a mark. For 100 days or more, the cold ruled everything. And yet, in this frozen dominion, the Vikings did not merely survive. They endured. They remained warm. They lived, worked, ate, dreamed, and prepared for spring as if winter were only another test to be mastered. This is the question that has puzzled historians and haunted archaeologists for generations: how did Viking communities remain warm for months on end, without modern insulation, without electricity, without central heating, and without mercy from their environment? The answer is not a single trick or clever invention. It is something far deeper, far more unsettling. It is a system of knowledge, hidden techniques refined through centuries of loss, hunger, and quiet deaths that never made it into songs. To understand Viking resilience, one must first understand fear. Not the loud, sudden fear of battle, but the slow fear of winter closing in. The fear that food might not last. That the fire might die in the night. That the walls might fail, or the roof might give way under snow. In the north, winter was not just a season. It was an intelligence, patient, relentless, and always watching for weakness. The Vikings knew this. They did not romanticize winter. They respected it the way one respects an executioner. Every decision they made in the warmer months carried the weight of what was coming. Their survival during winter was not improvised. It was engineered long before the first snowfall, built into the very bones of their lives. Villages were not placed randomly. Homes were not shaped by aesthetics. Nothing was accidental. The land itself was studied like an enemy battlefield. Slopes that blocked wind, earth that could be cut and shaped, proximity to water without exposure to storms, these were matters of life and death. A poorly chosen settlement meant slow suffering, not dramatic collapse. And the Vikings learned, generation by generation, exactly where warmth could be protected and where cold would always win. Inside their longhouses, warmth was not something added, it was something trapped. Heat was treated like a living thing, something that would escape the moment it found a weakness. The Vikings built low, heavy structures that pressed into the earth, using soil itself as insulation. The ground, cold on the surface, held a deeper, steadier temperature beneath. By lowering their homes into the land, they borrowed warmth from the planet itself. Fire sat at the heart of everything, but fire alone was never enough. An open flame can warm a body, but it can also steal heat by drawing air upward and out. The Vikings understood airflow long before science gave it a name. Smoke holes were positioned with ruthless precision, balancing ventilation with heat retention. Too large, and the warmth would vanish into the night. Too small, and the air would poison those inside. Every longhouse represented countless experiments, each failure paid for with sickness or death. Clothing, too, was a form of architecture. Layers of wool, treated hides, and carefully stitched seams created mobile shelters for the body. But warmth was not just about thickness. It was about dryness. Wet clothing in winter was a sentence, not an inconvenience. Vikings used natural oils, lanolin, and animal fats to repel moisture, turning their garments into barriers against snow and sleet. Even their sleeping arrangements reflected this knowledge: bodies pressed together, shared warmth treated as a resource rather than a comfort. Food was another hidden weapon. The Viking winter diet was not designed for pleasure. It was designed for survival heat. High-fat meats, preserved fish, fermented foods, all chosen because they burned slowly inside the body, generating warmth long after the meal ended. Hunger in winter was dangerous, but so was eating the wrong thing. The wrong food could leave a person cold, weak, and vulnerable. Knowledge of nutrition existed not as theory, but as lived experience etched into memory. Yet perhaps the most overlooked element of Viking winter survival was psychological. Isolation, darkness, and cold do not just attack the body, they erode the mind. For weeks at a time, the sun barely rose. Shadows dominated waking hours. The risk was not only freezing, but despair. And despair leads to mistakes. Stories, rituals, shared labor, and strict routines acted as invisible insulation. They gave structure to endless nights. They kept people moving, engaged, purposeful. A person who stopped working, who withdrew, who lost rhythm, was already halfway to death. The Vikings understood this intuitively. Winter demanded discipline. Every day had to mean something. What makes these techniques truly unsettling is that they were not written down as rules. They were absorbed. Learned by watching elders. Passed on through habit, not instruction. A child growing up in a Viking settlement did not learn how to survive winter. They learned what normal life looked like, and normal life already contained everything needed to endure the cold. This is why Viking resilience appears almost mythical from the outside. It was not built on heroic moments, but on invisible systems. On choices so deeply embedded they felt natural. On the understanding that winter could not be fought, only anticipated, respected, and quietly outsmarted. And yet, even with all this knowledge, winter still took lives. The difference was that the Vikings reduced chaos. They narrowed the margin where death could operate. Every technique, every habit, every design choice pushed survival just a little further into the darkness. As the first snow fell and the world closed in, Viking communities did not panic. They sealed themselves into warmth that had been prepared long in advance. Fires were lit with care. Doors were reinforced. Food stores were counted. The long night began. But the true test had not yet arrived. Because surviving the first weeks of winter was easy compared to what came next, the slow grind of time, when supplies dwindled, storms grew violent, and the cold stopped feeling temporary. That was when hidden techniques mattered most. That was when resilience revealed its true cost. And that is where the story truly begins. What happens to the human mind when the sun disappears not for hours, but for weeks? By the time the third phase of winter arrived, the world had narrowed to darkness, wind, and breath. The Vikings did not mark this moment with ceremony. They felt it in their bones. The light thinned each day until dawn became a rumor, a pale suggestion on the horizon that never truly rose. Shadows stopped moving. Time itself seemed to slow, stretch, and blur. This was the long night, the period when weakness surfaced, when mistakes became fatal, and when the hidden systems of Viking survival were finally put to the test. Inside the longhouse, life compressed inward. Walls that once felt spacious now seemed to lean closer with every storm. Smoke from the hearth curled thick beneath the roof beams, clinging to carved rafters blackened by generations of fires. But this smoke was not a flaw, it was intentional. It coated the wood in a protective layer, sealing tiny cracks, repelling moisture, preserving warmth. Every breath carried heat, and every exhale mattered. In winter, even breathing was an act of strategy. The Vikings understood something few civilizations ever truly mastered: warmth is not created, it is defended. Fire alone could not win against winter. Fire dies. Wind does not. So the longhouse was built as a fortress against loss. Low ceilings trapped heat. Sunken floors held warmer air close to sleeping bodies. Entrances were small, angled, and shielded, forcing cold winds to break before entering. There were no straight paths for the frost to follow. As days vanished, routines became rigid. Not out of tradition but necessity. Wood was rationed not by quantity, but by temperature. Fires were allowed to burn low, never roaring, never wasteful. A roaring fire consumed fuel too quickly and drew cold air inward. Instead, embers were kept alive, glowing quietly, wrapped in ash like hidden hearts. At night, stones warmed by the hearth were pulled close to sleeping areas, radiating stored heat long after flames faded. This was thermal memory, heat borrowed from the past to survive the future. Clothing, too, transformed during this phase. Outer garments were not simply layered, they were engineered. Wool trapped air. Fur blocked wind. Linen touched the skin to wick moisture away before sweat could freeze. Wetness was the true enemy now. A damp sleeve could kill as surely as a blade. So garments were dried constantly, hung near smoke, turned slowly, watched carefully. Even sleep was controlled. Bodies slept close, not for comfort, but for survival. Heat shared was heat saved. Outside, the world became hostile and silent. Snow buried landmarks. Ice swallowed paths, hunting parties grew smaller, movements slower. No one ventured far without reason. The land could no longer be trusted to give, it had to be challenged carefully. Traps were checked at dawn like moments of gray. Fish holes were cut through ice, marked, remembered. Memory replaced sight. The Vikings navigated by instinct and repetition, not visibility. But the greatest threat of the long night was not the cold. It was doubt. In the darkness, thoughts grew louder. Storms howled for days without pause. Roofs creaked under snow weight. Children whispered fears they could no longer see away. The elders knew this phase well. They had lived it before. And so stories returned not as entertainment, but as insulation for the mind. Tales of ancestors who survived worse winters. Of journeys made in deeper darkness. Of gods who tested humans not with fire, but with silence. Hope, like heat, had to be maintained. Every system worked together now: architecture, clothing, routine, psychology. Remove one, and the entire structure of survival weakened. This was the truth the Vikings never wrote down but lived by instinctively. Winter is not a season, it is a siege. And the long night was its strongest assault. Yet even here, deep in darkness, the Vikings did not merely endure. They adapted. And as the days pressed on toward their coldest point, a hidden danger began to form, one that no wall, fire, or fur could fully keep out. What happens when winter stops being a season and becomes an enemy that refuses to leave? By the time the fourth section of this long winter arrives, hope itself has thinned like breath in frozen air. The easy warmth is gone. The stored heat of autumn memories has faded. What remains is discipline, design, and the brutal intelligence of survival refined by centuries of failure. This is the moment where Viking resilience is no longer a clever idea, it is a relentless daily battle against death disguised as cold. Outside, the world has fallen silent. Snow no longer drifts gently, it hardens, compresses, and becomes a wall. The sun is a rumor, a pale presence that never truly rises, only sliding along the horizon like a watchful eye. The wind does not howl anymore, it stalks. It searches for cracks, weaknesses, mistakes. One loose board, one careless opening, one exhausted decision, and the cold claims its prize. Inside the longhouse, life has narrowed. Movements are slower now, deliberate. Every step is calculated, every breath measured. Heat is no longer something you feel, it is something you protect. The fire burns lower, not because fuel is scarce, but because waste is unforgivable. Flames are fed like living creatures, given just enough to survive but never enough to rage. A roaring fire would consume precious wood too quickly, and a dying fire would invite frost to creep across the floor like a silent invader. The architecture begins to reveal its true purpose in this phase of winter. Walls that once seemed thick now feel thin, not in weakness, but in honesty. The Vikings never trusted a single barrier. Instead, they built layers, knowing that warmth, like life, survives best when protected repeatedly. Timber walls are backed by packed earth, turf stacked in dense, uneven masses that trap air and resist the cold's advance. Snow itself becomes an ally, piling against the outer walls and forming an insulating shell. What looks like burial from the outside is protection from within. The air inside the longhouse is heavy, but it is alive. Smoke curls upward, not escaping fully, but lingering just enough to warm the rafters before slipping out through narrow vents. These openings are never wide. They are controlled wounds in the roof, carefully positioned so heat does not flee all at once. The smoke stains the wood black over time, but that darkness seals the grain, hardens it, makes it less vulnerable to rot and cold. Even decay is slowed by design. People gather closer now, not out of comfort, but necessity. Bodies are heat. Shared breath is warmth. Isolation is dangerous. The Vikings understood something modern minds often forget: survival is communal or it is nothing. At night, sleeping arrangements tighten. Furs overlap. Wool presses against wool. Children are placed between adults, not as a sign of tenderness, but strategy. The strongest bodies shield the weakest, and in doing so, preserve the future. Food changes in this section of winter. Freshness is gone. What remains is endurance. Dried fish, smoked meat, fermented grains, foods chosen not for pleasure, but for their ability to sustain heat from within. Fat becomes precious. A meal rich in fat is not indulgence, it is armor. It slows digestion, keeps the body working longer, producing warmth deep in the core when the fire cannot. Hunger is tolerated. Cold is not. The true danger now is not the storm, it is exhaustion. Muscles ache constantly. Fingers stiffen. The mind begins to wander into dark places where giving up feels tempting. This is why routine becomes sacred. Every day follows a rhythm older than memory: tend the fire, check the walls, redistribute furs, repair what the wind tried to steal in the night. These actions are not chores. They are rituals that keep fear from taking root. Even sound is controlled. Doors are opened slowly, only when necessary. Each opening is an invitation for winter to rush inside. When it does, it feels violent air knifing through the room, frost snapping at skin. The door closes quickly, sealed with leather and wood, and everyone waits. Seconds pass. Then minutes. Slowly, the warmth returns. Each successful sealing is a victory, small but essential. The elders speak more during this phase of winter. Not because they enjoy talking, but because memory is heat of another kind. Stories fill the space where sunlight once lived. Tales of past winters worse than this one. Of storms that buried entire settlements. Of years when the fire almost went out but didn't. These stories are not entertainment. They are proof. Proof that survival is possible, that endurance has precedent, that this suffering has an end, even if it cannot yet be seen. Outside, the days blend together. Inside, time is measured differently. Not by light, but by survival milestones. Another week endured. Another storm defeated. Another child waking up warm. Each is counted silently, stored like fuel in the mind. This is the heart of the 100 days. Not the beginning, where preparation feels strong. Not the end, where hope dares to return. This is the stretch where resilience is tested to its breaking point and reinforced. Where Viking ingenuity stops being impressive and becomes essential. Where warmth is no longer a comfort, but a carefully guarded flame of existence itself. And still, the winter presses on. What happens when winter stops being a season and becomes a sentence? By the third turning of the moon, the cold is no longer an enemy outside the walls. It has seeped into memory, into breath, into the bones themselves. The Vikings understood something brutal and profound: winter was not survived by fighting it, but by outlasting it. This is where resilience became ritual. Inside the longhouse, life reorganizes itself around warmth. Not comfort, survival warmth. Every movement is measured. Every task has purpose. The hearth is never allowed to sleep. Even in rest, someone is assigned to listen for the sound of dying embers. Fire is treated like a living thing, fed carefully, never overindulged, never starved. Ash is layered deliberately, insulating heat beneath its gray skin, preserving life until morning. Clothing becomes architecture. Wool is not just worn, it is layered with intent: inner garments tied to trap heat, outer cloaks loose to block wind. Animal skins are cured not for beauty but for breathability, allowing moisture to escape without stealing warmth. Dampness, the Vikings knew, was deadlier than frost. Food, too, plays its quiet role. Heavy stews simmer slowly, not just for nourishment but to humidify the air, easing breath in frozen lungs. Fat is treasured not as excess, but as fuel. The body becomes a hearth of its own, burning slow, burning steady. But perhaps the most important warmth is unseen. Stories are told nightly not for entertainment, but for endurance. Tales of ancestors who survived worse winters, longer darkness, greater loss. Memory itself becomes insulation. Fear is kept busy listening, imagining, believing. This is the hidden truth of Viking resilience: they did not wait for winter to break. They taught themselves how to live inside it. Section 4: The silence that tests the strongest. What happens when the fire still burns, but hope begins to freeze? Midwinter brings a deeper challenge, one no tool or technique can fully solve. The days grow so short they barely deserve the name. Sunlight becomes a rumor. Time stretches, shapeless and heavy. This is when winter tries to claim not the body, but the mind. The Vikings anticipated this. Their lives were engineered to resist despair as much as cold. Routine was sacred. Even when the world outside was locked in ice, inside the longhouse days followed structure: repairs, crafting, training, teaching. Hands were never idle, because idleness invited thoughts that could weaken resolve. Children were taught skills early, not just to prepare them for adulthood, but to anchor them in purpose. Elders shared wisdom, their presence a living reminder that survival was possible, that it had already been done. Sound mattered. Silence was dangerous. Tools striking wood, voices murmuring prayers to old gods, songs sung low and steady, these sounds filled the long nights, pushing back the creeping weight of isolation. Even grief was shared openly, so it could not fester alone in the dark. Outside, snow piled high against walls designed to lean inward, deflecting wind. Inside, people leaned toward one another. Proximity was not weakness, it was strategy. Body heat was shared. Burdens were shared. Survival was shared. This section of winter was the true test. Not starvation. Not frostbite. But the slow erosion of spirit. And still, they endured because they had built lives where no one survived alone. Section 5: When winter begins to lose. What changes when the cold realizes it has failed? Somewhere around the 100th day, something shifts. The winter is still brutal. The snow still lies heavy. But the fear is gone. The Vikings have crossed an invisible threshold. They are no longer merely surviving winter. They are outlasting it. Supplies are low, but calculated. No panic. No chaos. Every ration lasts because it was planned months before the first snow fell. Smoke rises steadily from longhouses that were designed to conserve heat, not leak it. Roofs layered with turf still breathe warmth downward. Walls packed with earth and stone remain stubbornly alive with stored heat. Outside, the cold still howls, but now it sounds tired. Inside, there is a quiet confidence. Muscles are lean but strong. Minds are sharpened by hardship. The people who emerge from this darkness will not be the same ones who entered it. Winter has stripped away weakness and left only what works. And when the light finally begins to return, slow, fragile, almost shy, it feels earned. Not celebrated loudly. Respected. The Vikings did not conquer winter. They studied it, prepared for it, and waited it out. And in doing so, they unlocked a resilience so powerful that even 100 days of frozen darkness could not extinguish it. Winter always comes. But so does endurance.